There is a kind of forgetting that feels natural, quiet, inevitable, and slow-moving. It does not arrive with a dramatic gesture or loud finality. It settles in gradually, like dust across a windowsill or moss between cobblestones. In the case of old places, weathered buildings, abandoned towers, forgotten chapels, this forgetting shows up in layers. First, the faces are gone. Then, the voices vanish. Then, the names. And finally, even the reason for the place itself starts to dissolve until the structure remains like a husk, a shell too stubborn to fall. The phrase "the names faded faster than the stone" encapsulates this kind of forgetting. It is not just about memory, but also the way time moves unevenly across different things. Stone holds on, but names slip away. Stone is slow to erode. Its resistance to time is visible. Cracks might form, edges may soften, but stone still remains long after the hands that shaped it have returned the dust. A carved name on a wall or a gravestone might seem eternal at first. It was chiseled in with certainty and permanence. But even stone can betray its promises. Names, though carved deeply, wear thin. The wind does not care what letters once marked its surface. Rain finds its way into the shallowest crevice, and sunlight bleaches without discrimination. In time, the name becomes a blur, a smudge, a suggestion that something was once there, but not quite. And even before the physical name disappears from the stone, the name often fades from memory. The stories once attached to it begin to tangle and fray. Those who remembered it grow old, and those who inherit the place might pass it without ever asking who he, Halpern or mere echelon once were. Maybe once, someone paused to wonder. Maybe they asked, who was that? What did they do? But if no one answers with certainty, the name becomes background noise, a whisper that no longer belongs to any particular mouth. There is a quiet tragedy in that. Not a loud, tragic cry, but a gentle erosion of presence. For a name is not just a label. It is a thread to a life lived. A name once belonged to someone who moved through their days, who sat down to meals, and who looked up at skies wondering about their own place beneath them. A name might have been spoken in affection, in command, in prayer, or in parting. Someone might have waited for that name to appear in a letter, might have sewn it into cloth, scratched it into a corner of a diary, or whispered it to a child falling asleep. But even so, the world does not guarantee preservation. Even the most cherished names dissolve if they are not spoken, if they are not passed on. To say that the names faded faster than the stone is to admit how fragile memory really is. Human memory, especially. We like to think of memory as something fixed, something we can revisit. But it's more like mist visible in one moment, vanished in the next. Time pulls at memory more harshly than it does at architecture. The bones of buildings last. The roof may collapse. The beams may warp. But a ruin remains to show that there was once a structure. A name, however, might not leave any trace unless it is recorded again and again. Names do not fossilize. They need to be remembered to remain. They need to be repeated. But there is also something gentle in this fading. Not all disappearances are harsh. Some are soft, like a song ending in a slow hush rather than a sharp cutoff. The phrase implies a passage of time, not a violent interruption. It does not say that the names were erased, only that they faded. Fading is a process. It allows room for memory to linger a little while, to stretch out before surrendering. The stone, meanwhile, remains not to betray the names, but to bear witness in their absence. An empty stage still holds the echoes of the last play performed. A doorway, even without a house, implies someone once passed through. The stone holds space for the name, even when the name is gone. And maybe that's all that can be asked of memory that it held for a while. That it did not disappear all at once. That the name, though eventually lost, once had a place. The stone, though impersonal, serves as a kind of container for the loss. In that way, the fading becomes a kind of tribute. The stone did not resist time on behalf of the name, but it did offer it a longer goodbye. It's also worth noticing the passive voice of the phrase. The names faded, not someone forgot them or they were erased, but simply, they faded. This suggests a natural passing, not a deliberate action. The world didn't set out to forget them. It simply moved forward, as it always does. In this way, the phrase invites acceptance rather than regret. It recognizes the melancholy beauty of impermanence. Not everything lasts, and perhaps it is not meant to. The fact that the names faded faster than the stone might feel sad, but it's also a reminder of how time prioritizes differently. Stone lasts because it doesn't feel. Names vanish because they do. This line could refer to a literal place, an abandoned monastery, a hillside graveyard, or a bell tower no longer in use. It might conjure an image of inscriptions half swallowed by lichen, barely legible etchings softened by years of weather. It might suggest that once, people stood in this place and spoke names aloud. Once, those names mattered enough to carve into stone. But time moved forward, and eventually, no one remained to keep the meaning alive. The stone, indifferent but patient, stayed. And now it stands alone with its fading marks, like a book no longer read but not yet burned. But the phrase might also work as a metaphor for personal memory. We all have names inside us that are beginning to fade, names of childhood friends, of long-dead relatives, of people whose stories we once heard but didn't keep. The stone in this sense is our body, our life, and our routines. We go on, even when our memories falter. We still wake, breathe, and move through the day. But something inside us gently slips away. The names we once held onto with clarity are now vague outlines. The stories attached to them unravel. And yet, we keep moving. We carry the shape of memory, even if not the details. Sometimes, we revisit those names. We find them in old letters or yearbooks. We hear them mentioned in passing and feel a strange tug, a recognition without context, a warmth or a pain that we can't quite name. And in that moment, the name reappears not entirely, but enough to remind us that it once meant something, that it was not always faded. And then, just as gently, it disappears again. There's also a question of legacy buried in this phrase. What do we hope remains of us? Our names? Our words? Our works? If names fade faster than stone, what is the best way to be remembered? Is it better to leave something physical behind or to exist in memory, even if briefly? The phrase suggests that even when we etch our identity into something meant to last, time has its own preferences. Stone endures, but not for us. Not in our terms. Still, perhaps the goal was never permanence. Perhaps it's enough that the name once had weight, that it was spoken, known, and loved. That someone, somewhere, cared enough to carve it. The fading is not a failure. It is a conclusion, or maybe just a transition. For while names may fade from stone, they may still be whispered in dreams or surface in stories not entirely forgotten. And even when that stops, the world goes on with traces quiet, background traces that someone once was here. The phrase leaves space for reflection. It is neither a warning nor a lament. It is simply an observation, a soft statement about how time moves, about what it leaves behind and what it lets go. It invites you to walk a little slower, to run your fingers across old stone, to wonder whose name it once bore. It does not ask for grief, only for pause. It suggests, too, that while names may not last, the act of naming does. That the impulse to mark, to record, to leave a trace that endures. Someone will come after and try again. They'll carve new names into new stone, believing, as others did, that this time it will be different, that this time the name will stay. And maybe it will for a while, but eventually, the stone will outlast the memory, and someone else will look at the faded letters and wonder. And so the cycle continues. Time does not stop, but in its flow, there is a strange, persistent grace. The grace of knowing that someone once tried to be remembered. The grace of knowing that forgetting is not a failure, just a quieter chapter. The stone is still there, after all. It may not speak the name anymore, but it holds the space where the name once was. There is a particular stillness and a group photograph that has outlived its names. It is not silence in the usual sense, not the hush of an empty room or the quiet of a sleeping town, but something deeper, a mute testimony to lives that once moved with purpose and rhythm and now remain only in posture. In these old portraits, people stand in rows or huddle shoulder to shoulder, dressed in their best or simply in what was proper, their faces trained toward the camera with the solemnity of the moment. They stare through time, their expressions frozen in an instant that once meant something, a gathering, a celebration, a mark of inclusion. But now, without captions, without names, their presence is suspended in the unknown. It is not that they are entirely lost. They are here, visible. You can see the sharp set of a jaw, the loose tension of someone who hated having their picture taken, and the barely concealed grin of a child trying not to move. Their clothes speak of eras. The stiff collars, the long skirts, and the carefully parted hair all whisper their decade. You can guess when, but you cannot guess who. And so, the photograph becomes not a record, but a riddle, a page of history with every label smudged out. There's a quiet tragedy in being remembered like this, not as a name, not as a story, but simply as a face. The dignity in their eyes hints at lives full of effort and emotion, of tasks repeated and laughter shared. The woman in the second row might have risen every morning to light the stove and mix dough while it was still dark. The man to her left might have built fences in winter winds or read aloud to his children on Sundays. But those details are gone, eroded not by malice but by time. The photo was once treasured, perhaps displayed on a mantle or tucked carefully in a drawer. Someone once could have pointed to each figure and said, "That's your uncle," or "She was the one who taught your grandfather to read." But now there is no one left to speak those sentences. When we come across these photographs in attics, antique shops, or family albums with gaps, we often pause. There is something magnetic about so many eyes meeting your own. There's weight in being looked at by people who never imagined you would exist. And yet, what do we give them in return? We glance, maybe smile, and move on. The faces stay still. They cannot protest their anonymity. They cannot demand to be known. Group portraits without captions suggest a collective memory that failed to root itself. We expect history to preserve the important, but what becomes of those who were simply part of the crowd? Not famous, not infamous, just there. They were once a we, a community, a family, a class, a choir, a team. The moment was likely important to them, enough to dress up, to gather, and to hold still for the camera. And now they are little more than an aesthetic sepia-toned rose of the forgotten. It's easy to romanticize them, to imagine that these were simpler times, that the people in the photographs led quaint, wholesome lives. But that too is erasure. The tired man might have worked a mine that sickened him. The proud child may have died young. The distant-looking woman in the back may have carried burdens no one else saw. Their lives were as full of contradictions and complications as any life is. Their faces hold not just the gloss of nostalgia, but also the complexities we'll never grasp. What does it mean to be remembered without being known? There's a difference. Remembrance without detail becomes something more atmospheric than personal. You don't remember these people as individuals. You remember them as types. The stern matriarch, the boy with ears too big for his head, the young man with a slicked down part and guarded smile. These roles become substitutes for names. We begin to read into their faces like we would characters in a story, guessing at their lives through expressions, postures, and the background scenery. Yet, even in this guessing, something human persists. You may not know who they were, but you know they were. Their presence asserts that. Their eyes, no matter how old the photo, often hold the uncanny sense of being captured mid-thought. It reminds you they had thoughts. They worried about things that mattered deeply at the time, but have since crumbled into irrelevance. They had routines. They likely had favorite meals, people they missed, and eggs that flared up in the cold. Someone once waited for them to come home. Someone may have stood just off camera, calling for them to smile. The absence of captions feels almost intimate in its neglect. It is not that no one ever knew it, as that the knowledge was never shared widely enough to last. Perhaps a label fell off. Perhaps no one bothered to write anything in pencil on the back. Perhaps someone assumed that everyone would remember. But memories need scaffolding. They need names, connections, and context. Without those, they dissolve more easily than we expect. Sometimes, the photograph itself becomes the last proof that these people ever stood side by side, ever breathed in the same moment. The photo outlasts the occasion, the house it was taken in, and the town it belonged to. It finds its way into a box, then a drawer, then a stranger's hands. And when it is held again, there is a pause not just for curiosity, but for recognition of something that feels familiar even if it isn't. That pause is a small form of reverence. There's a reason these photos can feel haunting, not in a ghostly sense, but in the way they quietly challenge our assumption that memory is enough. We build our lives surrounded by people, sharing time and experience, and we assume that our place in the story will endure. But often it doesn't. Without words, without recordings, our stories flatten into impressions. We become one of many, a face among faces, a hint of someone. And yet there's a comfort, too, because in these anonymous photos, we see that being remembered by name isn't the only kind of legacy. There is a legacy in gesture and shared space, and in the fact that these people once mattered enough to be photographed together. Someone thought the moment was worth capturing. That intention lingers. The photograph might no longer answer questions, but it still asks one. Can you imagine who we were? This, too, is a kind of memory, one that doesn't rely on accuracy, but on empathy. You may not know the name of the girl in the front row, but you recognize the way she's tilting slightly toward the friend beside her. You may not know the teacher who stands stiffly at the back, but you understand the formality of someone trying to appear more confident than they feel. You may not know the occasion, but you felt what it's like to be part of something briefly important. The faces, though unnamed, offer entry points into your own life. They remind you that one day, photographs of your gatherings may lack labels. Your friends might be some cousins, your co-workers unknown men. A group selfie from a birthday might become someone's riddle. Who were these people? Why did they gather? Were they happy? So when you see a group portrait with no captions, pause. Look closely. See how some people lean in, how some stand stiffly apart. Notice the shoes, the hands, and the folds in clothing. Imagine the noises in the room just before the shutter clicked, the shuffle of feet, the clearing of throats, the breath held. Consider the moment after, when everyone blinked and turned away, the photograph taken and life resumed. They are gone, but they are not entirely lost. Their names may not be spoken, but they were once spoken often. Their stories may be unknown, but they were once told around tables. Their presence in the photo is a small insistence, we were here. And though they cannot be reclaimed individually, the image holds them all together still. In a way, the lack of captions democratizes memory. No one in the photo is more important than the other. The mayor and the maid, the brother and the neighbor, they all share the same silence now, the same anonymity. And in that shared forgetting, they remain equal. Held together in the same faded paper, the same sepia light, their dignity remains. Not because we remember their names, but because we still stop to look, still wondering, still feel the echo of lives that were fully lived, even if we'll never know exactly how. The bell tuner, quiet and focused, brought harmony to sound, aligning tones with care only the human ear could refine. These were not casual crafts, nor momentary trends. They were vocations, carried out with devotion so complete that each gesture became a ritual. And yet now, they linger only as echoes without urgency, without lineage. Their silence is not sudden, but accumulated. To be a wheelwright was to understand wood on a first-name basis. Ash, elm, oak, these weren't just materials, but trusted collaborators. A wheel was not a simple circle, but a calculated dance of compression, friction, balance, and burden. A single wheel bore the weight of travel, of transport, of trade, of time itself moving forward. The wheelwright didn't merely shape timber, he shaped a journey. When roads were made of dirt and stones, and distances were measured by the jostle of a cart. His work defined how far you could go and how long it would take. Each spoke, an iron rim was measured not only by calipers, but by instinct, by the wrist flicks and grain reeds passed down from father to son. Until one day, no son asked. The ink grinder's world was quieter still, but no less vital. Ink, in its earliest craft, was not poured from plastic bottles or purchased in cartridges. It was mixed ground slowly from soot, minerals, and oils with the patience of one who knew the weight of what ink could carry. The recipe could take days. A single misstep might ruin the batch. Yet once perfected, it could last for centuries. Monks, scholars, calligraphers all depended on the ink grinder's skill. The blackness of letters, the smoothness of stroke, the resistance or glide on vellum or paper, these were not accidental, but deliberate. But when printing presses grew industrial arms, and colors were replicated with chemical certainty, no one came to ask about the quiet stone, the mortar bowl, or the feel of just ground gall ink between finger and thumb. The stone was shelved. The bowl was unwashed. No one asked for the recipe. The bell tuner, though perhaps the most mysterious of the three, held a job both technical and spiritual. Bells were not simply rung, they were meant to resonate with the landscape, to signal time, worship, warning, or celebration. A bell that was even slightly off-key could carry the wrong message, or simply irritate rather than summon. Tuning a bell involves shaving down its interior, melting and reshaping, tapping and listening with the ear of a trained musician who never played a note. But once the clocks became digital and the towers fell silent, except for the occasional commemorative chime, tuning became obsolete. The bell still hung, yes, but its tone was no longer corrected, its imperfections no longer smoothed. Those who once knew how to restore its voice were gone, and no one had bothered to ask why the bell no longer sounded quite right. And so, the museum drawers filled. Tools were labeled, cataloged, and sometimes displayed behind glass. The chisel was worn down from years of splitting spokes. The inkstone dulled at the edges from centuries of swirling pigment. The tuning fork, once struck beside bronze, is now still. These artifacts sit not as dormant things, but as quiet reminders of hands that once worked with purpose no longer required. There is no grief in their stillness, only a kind of patient waiting, like tools that expect to be picked up again. They are not bitter, only unused. What does it mean that no one asked to inherit these skills? It is not only a loss of craft, but a shift in how time unfolds. Once, apprenticeship was a kind of trust and unspoken contract that knowledge would be carried forward. A boy might spend a decade at his master's side before earning his bench, and even then, he would not call himself a master lightly. There was humility in learning slowly, a sense of identity forged through the repetition of tasks until the movements became part of muscle memory. Now, with speed and convenience as the new virtues, such slowness is not merely impractical, but unfathomable. No one asked to be a wheelwright because no one needed wheels made that way anymore. Trucks arrive with tires molded in factories, balanced by machines. And yet, a part of the world, the part that once required precision through imperfection, fades with it. No one asked to be an ink grinder because ink is abundant, synthetic, and expected. Its permanence is no longer trusted, its creation no longer honored. And the bell who asks a bell anything anymore? The idea that it should be tuned, adjusted, or even listened to carefully is quaint at best, forgotten at worst. But perhaps the most haunting part is that these occupations disappeared not with protest, but with silence. They were not banned or outlawed. They were simply not needed. And so they slipped out of the room quietly, like someone leaving a dinner party early without saying goodbye. It's tempting to romanticize them, to say that those old crafts held something sacred, something modern life has lost. But it's not only nostalgia. There was something in the patience of those jobs, in the long, slow learning of materials, that created more than products. It created people who knew how to notice things. A wheelwright knew when a wood was dry just by its sound under the blade. An ink grinder could tell when the mix was right just by the sheen. A bell tuner could detect a flaw by a vibration that passed through his ribs rather than his ears. These were not just skills, they were modes of being. And so, when we say no one asked to inherit these trades, we are saying more than that the tools went unused. We are saying the ways of seeing and sensing that came with them were also unclaimed. The apprentices never arrived. The questions were never asked. And the answers, waiting quietly in old journals or unspoken gestures, faded gently into dust. There is a drawer in a small museum somewhere that holds an iron compass with hand-carved handles. It once traced perfect circles in the blueprints of carts. The person who used it is long dead, their name perhaps etched on a faded placard nearby. Visitors pass it without much notice. But once, the compass was a tool of purpose, touched daily by hands that knew its quirks and ticks. No one has picked it up in decades. And yet, it waits. And maybe that is what remains, the quiet persistence of these old tools. Still waiting for someone who might one day ask, not out of necessity, but out of reverence. Someone who might feel the weight of a bell and wonder what makes it sing. Someone who might grind pigment just to see how it behaves on rough parchment. Someone who might touch the spoke of an old cartwheel and imagine the road it once turned upon. In a world that rewards utility, these occupations are no longer useful. But they were never merely about usefulness. They were about the relationship between person and material, between sound and silence, between one generation and the next. And now, with the links broken, the silence is not empty. It is full of waiting. So perhaps this is not a story of endings, but of suspension. The wheelwright's bench has not crumbled. The ink grinder stone has not shattered. The bell still rings slightly off, perhaps, but it rings. And the apprentices, they may still come, not to restore an economy, but to restore a sense of touch, time, and tone that modern life has misplaced, not out of need, but out of wonder. And when they come, if they come, they may find that the tools still work, the wood still bends, the ink still darkens, the bell still sings, because the work never truly disappeared. It simply stopped being asked for. And now, behind the museum glass or under attic dust, it is still there, waiting to be remembered. There is something profoundly human in the intention to leave something behind. A trace, a story, a recipe passed down not by memory, but by ink and parchment. The books they never wrote were not forgotten things, they were almost things. Almost letters, almost legacies, almost efforts scribbled half in thought and half in gesture, but never in finality. They lingered at the edge of being, trapped between a lived moment and a postponed one. They were meant to be written, but life, as it does, kept happening. They meant to write down the way she stirred the soup, not by measurement, but by the way it sounded when the spoon dragged along the bottom of the pot. They meant to describe the cadence of a lullaby that only one grandmother sang, and only one child heard. They meant to jot down the peculiar story about how the cupboard once stuck for 7 years and then, inexplicably, opened on its own. They meant to, but didn't. There was laundry to be brought in. A guest is arriving sooner than expected. A nap was taken instead, because rest felt more urgent than remembrance. The silence of unwritten books is not loud. It does not demand to be heard. Instead, it nestles into corners and folds itself into routines. It becomes a kind of background music, muted, unfinished, but present. The unwritten book is not a failure of memory or effort. It is the echo of a life to full, or to quiet, or simply to distract it to pause long enough for transcription. There are shelves somewhere, not literal ones, but imagined, filled with the unwritten. Books with no titles, only intentions. Covers unmade, pages unstained. And yet, in some soft way, these phantom books remain as real as the ones that exist. They are shaped by the fingerprints of almost writing. They carry the dust of what someone meant to say. One person once meant to record how the rain sounded on the roof the night they chose not to leave. Not for historical reasons, but because they believed there was a kind of weather that made people stay, and it should be documented. Another meant to write the family's bread recipe not for fame, just so someone could make it when the house was empty and needed filling with scent. Another meant to write down how his mother smiled, not for poetry's sake, but because someday someone might inherit the same smile and wonder where it came from. They didn't write those things, not because they didn't care, but because the world kept turning quietly. The pencil rolled off the table. The paper was to clean and to final. The moment came, and then it didn't stay long enough. What gets written down is not always what matters most. Sometimes it's just what happens to survive a moment of stillness. A diary begun in the middle of a crisis, but abandoned once peace returned. A song noted in the margins of a newspaper, forgotten in a drawer. A list of names for children that never came. A dream jotted in haste on the back of a receipt. All beginnings, all fragments. None of the books they meant to write. Sometimes they bought the notebook. They prepared. The first page, blank and expectant, sat waiting for months. Sometimes it remained blank forever. Sometimes it was filled with a single word, tomorrow. And then life intruded again. The tragedy of the unwritten book is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is marked by the absence of urgency. I'll write it down later. It's not the right time. It's all in my head. These are not lies, they're acts of hope. Hope that the memory will hold. Hope that the next day will offer more space. Hope that intention is enough. But intention fades. There is an old cabinet in someone's house that once held the napkin where the pie crust formula was scrawled in faint pencil. It's not there anymore. The pie is remembered vaguely. Not quite right when replicated. The crust was ever as flaky, the butter to flour ratio just off. But the scent that remains. Some things imprint in the senses even when they never made it to paper. And yet somewhere, there was a moment, a near moment, a woman standing at the kitchen table, her hands dusted in flour, looking at a clean page in a notebook. She had the urge to write. Maybe she even picked up the pen. But a child called from the next room, or the oven timer rang, or the phone buzzed. She turned her head, stepped away. The page remained blank. The book remained unwritten. The unwritten books are not failures of discipline. They are memorials to days that filled themselves. There's a grace in that, too, in knowing that life was so full that it didn't make room for documentation. But still, we wonder, what did they mean to say? What were the words they didn't put down? Did they have advice, warnings? Recipes for joy, cautions about grief, a song no one else knew. Sometimes you find a note in the back of a drawer. Half a line, a doodle, a single word underlined twice. It's tempting to imagine the rest. That's the gift the unwritten books give us. They leave space for dreaming. They thought someone else would write it. That is perhaps the most haunting part of it. Not selfishness, but a quiet deferral. I don't have to. Someone else will. But no one else did. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know what needed writing. The pages were never torn from a calendar. The story never told of how the people met under the tree and what was said. The precise method for tying that knot. The reason the bell used to ring every fourth Thursday. The melody hummed but never named. The way she said his name that one time and never again. They linger in the air and memory, in the tilt of someone's head when they try to recall. You can almost see it, the invisible sentence they wish they knew. There were books they never wrote, but also books no one thought to ask for. Books that would have explained why the old door sticks when it's humid. Books that describe how to stitch the torn cuff the same way grandmother did. Books that weren't meant for publication or prestige. They were meant for one person, or maybe two. Quietly, privately. Like love letters that stayed unsealed. And yet, some part of them survives. In retelling, in guessing, in repeating the same story one more time over dinner. I think she used nutmeg, someone says. Or maybe it was cloves. I don't know. She never wrote it down. And then, the not knowing becomes part of the recipe itself. A kind of inherited uncertainty. A sacred gap. Sometimes not writing is an act of trust. Trusting that memory will do enough. That the person beside you is listening. That the child watching will remember. Sometimes the trust is misplaced. But sometimes, it's enough. The books they never wrote weren't always about big things. They were often about small ones. how to fold the linen napkin just so, why did the dog always bark at 3 a.m., what he said to her on the last night when everyone else was asleep. They didn't write them not because they weren't important, but because they were important, and writing them down felt like reducing them, making them smaller. So they kept them in the only place that felt big enough: silence. It's easy to mourn what was never written, but it's also easy to forget what was never meant to be written. Not everything has to become a book. Not every moment wants to be captured. Some were meant to live and vanish, not because they didn't matter, but because they did. Still, there's a peculiar ache in opening an old notebook and finding only blank pages. The shape of what might have been. The hushed possibility. It's like hearing the echo of a bell you've never seen. But maybe, in a way, we are the books they never wrote. We who remember, who imagine, who try to piece together what they might have said. We keep writing about the absences. We fill in the blanks, even if clumsily. We become their footnotes, their errata, their second editions, because someone has to, because they thought someone else might, and even if no one did then, someone might now. And that, perhaps, is enough. Even now, the spaces they lived in remember more than we do. The scent of soap they used, the way the chair leaned slightly left. Their absence hums quietly in every thread. It is strange how rooms retain the memory of people long after they have gone. Not in grand or cinematic ways, but in the smallest, most persistent ones. You walk in, and something catches your breath before you even know why. It's not the furniture or the arrangement of objects. Those can be dusted and moved, replaced, or repurposed. What remains is something less visible, more difficult to name. A familiarity in the air. The echo of routines that once repeated themselves so often they became part of the floorboards. The space does not cry out for attention. Instead, it waits, as if a certain someone might still return to claim it. The smell, that's the first thing. Memory does not store scent easily, but rooms do. The faint trace of lavender soap, the ghost of cooking oil in the walls, tobacco, maybe, or a certain kind of cologne, something you hadn't thought about for years until it caught you unexpectedly one quiet afternoon. You paused then, didn't you? Not because the smell itself was strong, but because it was specific. It was them, or more precisely, it was what being near them used to feel like. The chair that leaned slightly left, who would notice that but someone who sat across from it? Enough times to know. The worn spot on the armrest, rubbed smooth from the passage of a hand that always found its way there during conversation or contemplation. It's nothing dramatic, just a soft slope where time decided to gather. These are the details the room remembers. The angle of light they like to sit in. The corner they always left their cup. The drawer never closed all the way. You think it's clutter, disarray, but the room knows better. It's muscle memory. There is something unbearably tender about a room that has been left behind. Not abandoned, just paused, as if the life that once filled it might resume at any moment. The bed still holds a slight curve in the mattress, the impression not yet erased by time. The closet smells like their decisions what to wear, who to be that day. And the books, oh the books, underlined passages, turned corners, and a receipt left as a bookmark. They were halfway through something once. The story has stayed open, waiting. You may clean it, rearrange, paint over the walls. Even still, the feeling settles back in, like dust. You might not notice it every day, but sometimes, without meaning to, you enter and breathe differently. Your shoulders drop, your eyes scan for signs. Not a presence, exactly, but a familiarity. You are not looking for them, you say, and yet, you notice when the room still smells like them. You notice when the silence in the room is shaped like someone you once knew. Absence isn't always hollow. Sometimes it is dense, saturated with things unsaid and gestures left incomplete. The last time they adjusted the blinds, the way they used to pause before speaking, the humming, the way they stood when lost in thought, slightly off balance, as if leaning into something only they could see. None of these things have left the room. They live in the space between the furniture and the soft sigh of air when the door swings closed without help. Some rooms, don't forget, they wait without impatience, without expectation, just quietly, the way time waits. A folded sweater in the drawer, a clock that still ticks, even though no one listens. The photograph you keep meaning to move, but don't. Each item holds a gravity you can't explain. You tell yourself they're just things, but things remember, not in the way people doom a silly. With nostalgia and contradiction, but with stillness, with unwavering presence. It's possible that the scent is fading, that each time you notice it, it's just memory trying to reassemble itself, patching together a sensation from fragments. But maybe not. Maybe the room is doing what we can, holding on, quietly, to what mattered. Not asking questions, not spinning stories. Just being. A place where something happened. A space where someone was known. The rooms that still smell like them are rarely loud about it. They don't draw you in with drama. They just exist, steady and soft. A drawer that opens with more resistance than you remember. A mark on the windowsill where something used to sit. You didn't see it before, but now you can't stop looking. It's like reading between the lines of a letter you've already memorized. You think you know what it says, but the pauses start to mean more. Sometimes you sit in their chair, not out of ritual, just habit or curiosity, and you find yourself sitting the way they did, leaning the way they leaned, as if the room, in its subtle way, is teaching you how to remember. It doesn't scold or grieve. It simply shows, this is where they sat. This is how the light fell across their shoulder. This is what it meant to be here with them once. There's a quiet loyalty in the way rooms hold on. You may change, you may move away, but the room waits for your return, as if certain some part of you is still trying to understand what was lost. Not to fix it, not to bring it back, just to know, just to sit for a moment in the same light, breathing the same air, listening to the same silence that once held their voice. You begin to understand that remembering isn't always loud. It doesn't require music or montage. Sometimes it's just sitting still long enough to notice that something is not quite gone, that the world, in its constant motion, has somehow spared this place, has let it remain just as it was so that you could return and feel not whole, not healed, but held. The scent will fade, the grooves in the chair will soften, the fabric will fray, but for now, the room remembers, and that is enough. Eventually, someone else might live there. The scent will change, the chair may be replaced, the drawer may finally close all the way. That's the way of things, but even then, there will be something, perhaps just a faint pause in the air. A shadow that doesn't belong, something that says, someone was here once, and they were loved. We think we are the keepers of memory, but sometimes the walls do a better job. They don't rewrite, and they don't romanticize. They just endure, quietly, faithfully. And so, the room still smells like them, not because they are coming back, but because they were here. Truly here. And the room, unlike most of us, never tried to forget. There was a rhythm to her sweeping that did not ask to be noticed. It was not dramatic, not the kind of motion that would draw a curious gaze or provoke admiration. It simply existed, like the steady, soft breath of an old house still standing after all its original reasons for being had fallen away. Her broom moved with a soft sound, less a scrape and more a hush. The whisper of bristles against stone worn smooth by centuries of feet that no longer came. She began in the same corner each morning, though no one asked her to. No one marked her attendance or kept track of where she had left off the day before. And yet, she returned. There was no ceremony in her beginning, no prelude or signal, just the gentle clack of the wooden handle as she picked it up, the shift of her shoulders as she leaned forward, and then that soft, patient sweep. Dust rose sometimes, catching the light as it spun upward in slow curls before settling again. She did not rush to catch it. She knew it would come back. It always came back. That wasn't the point. In the corners of the old hall, where time had gathered more dust than memory, her broom traced the edges of the forgotten. She never moved quickly. This was not work for finishing. It was not a task to be completed, only continued. The act of sweeping had become something else entirely. Not maintenance, not duty. A kind of quiet defiance against the slow unraveling of place and purpose. She swept to remind herself that something could still be touched, still be changed. Even if only for a moment. No one had walked those halls in years, not in any real sense. Not with intention, not with shoes meant for visiting or voices meant to echo. The air held a particular kind of stillness, the kind that settles over places when they have been let go of. And yet, there she was, with her broom, tracing old lines as if they mattered. As if the paths her sweeping carved were still meant to guide someone. As if the dust she moved aside might reveal something beneath it. Not a secret, not even a story, just the floor itself, as it once was. There had once been reasons. She did not deny that. People used to come. There were times, long before, when footsteps filled the hall and laughter spilled through the high archways. Some voices called out names she could no longer recall. They had needed her then, or perhaps needed the place, and by extension, needed her to keep it ready, to keep it dignified, swept. But now, those people were gone. Their names had faded from stone plaques, and their intentions had long since crumbled into something unreadable. Still, she swept. It would be easy, you might think, to let it all go, to walk away from the dust, to abandon the task no one acknowledged. But she found something in the pattern, the simplicity, the small, wordless comfort of cause and effect. One stroke of the broom, and the dust scattered. Briefly, the floor looked cared for again. Briefly, the world was changed by her hand. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and in a life that asked very little from her, this was enough. There were days when the dust returned before she had even finished. Wind slipped through unseen cracks. Particles floated in from the outside, unnoticed until they settled in places she had just cleared. But even then, she did not complain. She had made peace with the persistence of dust, just as one learns to make peace with the return of night after every day, the recurrence of small undoings. She understood that things didn't stay clean, not really, not forever, but that didn't mean they didn't deserve the attempt. The act of sweeping was not about preserving the past, not anymore. It was not about honoring those who had once walked here or protecting some illusion of significance. It was about being present. Each stroke of the broom was an act of remaining, of choosing to stand in the quiet space between abandonment and insistence, where nothing was required, but something was still offered. Her work didn't build, it didn't accumulate, it didn't stack toward a result or move toward a reward. It just circled and returned, like breath. Sometimes she would pause not to rest, but to notice. The shaft of light that fell through the window made the motes of dust look almost golden. The way the silence seemed to shift as she moved from one end of the room to the other, like it was adjusting to her presence. The way the old stones remembered her footsteps. These were not things anyone else would care about, but they mattered in the world she occupied. They were proof that even in stillness, there was life. Quiet, yes, gentle, but life all the same. In other places, other times, routines demanded something. Efficiency, output, performance. Here, the routine asked for nothing. It did not measure her. It did not expect her to improve. It simply waited, and she met it daily, not with obligation, but with a kind of humble companionship. There was solace in knowing that nothing depended on her, and yet, somehow, something waited for her all the same. The dust returned, but so did she, and perhaps that was enough to count as meaning. There were no clocks in the hall, no bells to chime the hour. Time passed by the light on the floor, by the slow drift of shadow from one wall to the next. She didn't track it, didn't need to. When the work was done, or close enough to done, she would stop. She would lean the broom against the same spot on the wall. She would press her hands against her lower back, stretch, and breathe. That breath was as much part of the routine as the sweeping itself. A signal not of completion, but of pause. A moment to acknowledge the effort. However slight, however impermanent, she had once thought about stopping. About letting the dust pile up, letting the silence become opaque with neglect. But the idea left a coldness in her that she didn't like, not fear. Not guilt, just a kind of hollowness. A sense that if she stopped sweeping, something small but steady might vanish. Not something grand, just a thin thread of presence. That echo of being. She didn't need the work to matter to anyone else, but she needed it to exist. A trace of touch in a world that had otherwise let go of hands. Some days, the wind blew harder. It kicked up the dust in little spirals, undoing more than she had managed to do in an hour. Those were not her favorite days, but she still showed up. She still swept, not with frustration, not with defeat, just with that same quiet motion. Back and forth, knowing the dust did not care whether she won, and neither did she. It was never about winning. She rarely spoke. There was no one to speak to, and besides, she didn't need the words. Her broom made its kind of speech soft, deliberate, repetitive. If someone had watched her, really watched her, they might have seen the poetry in it. But no one watched. That was the point. It was a ritual without an audience, a dance without applause, and that was what made it whole. There are places in this world where the grand matters less than the repeated, where significance is not measured by size or scope, but by willingness. The willingness to return, to show up, to place your hands on the handle and make a quiet offering to the day, even when the day offers nothing back. She understood that, and so she swept. Her footprints sometimes remain, if only for a moment. The dust gave her that small grace before reclaiming the floor. There was something tender about that, something deeply human, to be briefly visible, briefly marked, before being folded back into the fabric of silence. She did not mind. She did not long to be remembered, only to be real, even just for now. The broom had worn smooth beneath her fingers. She knew its balance, its weight. It had become like an extension of her arm, her thought. It did not resist her, and she did not force it. They worked together, in soft agreement. And though the dust was tireless, so was she. Not fierce, not stubborn, just constant, just present. And when the day faded, when the light dipped low and the shadows began to gather more tightly, she would finish her last stroke and lean the broom once again against its place. She would look at the floor, not clean, not perfect, but different, changed, even if only slightly. And that was enough. The dust would come again. She knew that, but so would she. There is a quiet intimacy and familiarity, especially with something that doesn't speak back, doesn't move or change quickly, but still carries the weight of time. The sentence she knew each line in the stone, each tiny shift where time had changed the surface paints not just a picture of observation, but of connection, of memory stitched into a surface. This isn't about a woman glancing at old walls and thinking nothing more. This is about a ritual of noticing, of caring through noticing, of remembering through contact with the unmoving. And even though the object of attention stone does not respond, it offers something deeper, continuity. The cracks in the stone are not damage in her eyes. They are not flaws. They are familiar. This word familiar changes everything. It implies a relationship that has grown over time, slowly, subtly, but persistently. These cracks are not just physical, they are historical. Each one has a story, even if that story is wordless, even if it's never told aloud. They are markers of days that have passed, maybe winters that froze and expanded the surface, summers that dried it, earthquakes that trembled beneath it, the weight of a footstep repeated over 100 years. These cracks do not declare themselves loudly, but they are there, etched quietly and undeniably into the world. She knew each line. This suggests that the woman has been here for a long time, long enough to study a surface most would forget to glance at. Long enough for that surface to become not just background, but record. And not just any record, but one she's memorized without needing to try. It's not the knowing of deliberate study, but the knowing that comes from repetition and care, from living with something, from passing the same place so often that your fingertips could trace the fissures blindfolded, from having watched it change slowly, not suddenly, not all at once, but over years, enough that each tiny shift registers, like noticing a new line on a loved one's face. Where time had changed the surface, the phrase contains a lifetime. Time, in this case, is not the enemy. It's not rushing or eroding or tearing anything away. It is simply doing what it always does, moving forward and marking as it goes. And the surface responds, not dramatically, but in small ways. A crack deepens, a line lengthens, a chip appears. The world does not announce these changes. There is no ceremony for them, but she sees them. And that is the difference. She sees what others walk past. She remembers what others let fade. She didn't smooth them out. There's something important here. It's not that she couldn't, perhaps. She might have had the means or tools or time, but that wasn't the point. The cracks were not something to be fixed, not something to erase. There's a quiet respect in that refusal to alter them. In an age where restoration is often prized, where the impulse is to fix things back to what they were, her decision stands apart. It says, this, as it is, matters. This weathered version holds more meaning than a polished one. The cracks are not blemishes, they are truths. By remembering where the cracks are, she keeps their stories alive. Her memory becomes an act of preservation. Even if she tells no one, even if she never writes it down, the fact that someone knows where the lines have formed and how they have shifted, that someone remembers, is a kind of quiet defiance against forgetting. It is an act of caretaking without touch. She tends to them by seeing, by knowing, by refusing to look away. That's all, and that is enough. One can imagine her walking the same hallway each day, pausing briefly in a certain spot, eyes brushing over the wall, noting that yes, it's still there. That line, that chip, that slight curve in the surface that wasn't there 10 years ago. And though she might say nothing aloud, there's an internal record, a private ledger, a mental photograph that updates itself slowly. This practice, this quiet chronicling of time, as passage might be the only ritual that remains when everything else is gone. No one else may remember what used to hang on that wall, or who passed through the doorway, or when the step cracked, but she does. The cracks, then, become a language, not one spoken with words, but one felt and read in silence. It is the language of a place slowly aging, and of a person who is not turned away. The lines in the stone are like sentences written by time itself, and she has learned to read them, not to interpret them necessarily, not to turn them into narrative or explanation, but to notice, to acknowledge, to say, simply by witnessing, I see you. I remember. There's also something here about acceptance. She didn't try to prevent the cracking. She didn't fight it. She didn't rush to cover it up. In a world often driven by the need to preserve perfection, to halt aging, to deny erosion and change, her attitude offers a kind of counterweight, a serenity, a quiet embracing of what is and of what continues to become. She does not resist time. She travels with it. She lets it do what it will, and she stays near, not as a guardian, not as a restorer, but as a witness. That role, witness, is crucial. Not every history needs to be loudly told. Not every story needs to be shouted or written down in books. Some stories live only in the soft attention of someone who noticed, of someone who stayed, who cared enough not to forget. In this way, she becomes the record keeper, even without pen or paper. The cracks do not tell their own stories to just anyone, but they speak to her, and she listens. The act of remembering the cracks is, in a way, an act of love. A love not for beauty or glamour or fame, but for truth, for the small and the persistent, for the slow work of time made visible. It is a love that honors the unseen and the overlooked, that treats a line and a stone as something sacred, not because of what it represents, but because it simply is, because it exists and has lasted and been known. And this kind of love doesn't need grand gestures. It doesn't need to be performed. It happens quietly, without announcement, in a passing glance, in the way she might shift her weight to avoid a certain spot, in how she brushes her hand against the wall on her way by, not to clean it, not to inspect, but just to touch, just to feel the familiar under her fingertips. That's all. That's everything. One might wonder how long she has known those stones. Was it from childhood? Did she return after decades away? Did she inherit the place or discover it by accident and stay longer than expected? The sentence doesn't say, but it doesn't need to, because the kind of familiarity described doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't come from a passing phase or a short visit. It is cultivated slowly. Repetition, patience, silence. This is a knowing that can't be hurried. In the end, this small moment, this quiet remembering of cracks is not small at all. It is the heart of memory, the soul of place, the essence of what it means to stay connected. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, but it is real, deeply, quietly real. And in a world that often forgets what it does not photograph or publish, this kind of attention matters more than ever. She knew each line in the stone, each tiny shift where time had changed the surface. She didn't smooth them out. She simply remembered where they were. This sentence is about far more than just stone. It's about grief that softens but doesn't disappear. About love that doesn't need to be loud to last. About aging with grace. About places that live in us because we lived in them. About change that does not erase, but transforms. About choosing not to look away from what time does to the things we hold dear. And about choosing, every day, to remember. To be the one who remembers even if no one else does. And maybe, just maybe, that is what memory truly is. Not a perfectly preserved snapshot, not a museum behind glass, but a lived-in map of cracks and shifts and wear. A surface that has been touched by life, marked by it, and not hidden. And someone, somewhere, still knows where those lines are, still sees them, still. Let's let them speak, and listens. That is enough. That is everything. There are moments in history and daily life alike that carry meaning not in what is done loudly, urgently, or even consciously, but in what is done quietly, repeatedly, and without fanfare. The image of the woman who never replaced her broom is one of those moments, a quiet ritual, a practice carried out day after day until it becomes a kind of invisible choreography. This broom, ordinary, worn, unassuming, embodies a philosophy of use, of attention, of time, and ultimately, of care. And in that worn broom, and her insistence on continuing with it, there is an entire world of meaning. To begin with, we can understand the broom itself not merely as a cleaning tool, but as a living record of effort and constancy. Its handle has been polished, not by design, but by repeated touch. Her hands have shaped its surface, smoothed its edges, and left behind oils and traces of use. This polishing is unintentional art, a natural result of prolonged, consistent contact, and it marks time in a way no clock can. Unlike a watch or calendar, which counts time impersonally, the polished broom handle is time made physical. It tells the story of her presence, her effort, and her continuity. She held that handle so often that it remembered the shape of her grip. The bristles, thin to a whisper, speak to another form of wear. The gradual erosion not from neglect, but from usefulness. The phrase is poetically charged. Bristles that once swept with vigor now move almost soundlessly, suggesting gentleness, maybe even fragility. And yet, it was enough. This is crucial. It did not need to be new, bristling, or powerful. It needed only to function, to participate in the rhythm of her life. The broom's effectiveness is not judged by modern standards of efficiency, but by its quiet suitability. It did what she needed it to do, and so it remained. There is something deeply human in that choice, to continue using what still works, even if imperfectly, rather than discard it for something shiny and new. It speaks to a relationship with tools, objects, and routines that is increasingly rare in a culture driven by upgrades, replacements, and obsolescence. Here, we see the opposite, a form of loyalty to the object, born not of sentimentality, but of understanding its role. The broom may not speak, but it participates. It witnesses. It serves. It is as much a part of the daily story as she is. But let us now turn to the woman herself. Who is she? This figure who continues to use the worn broom. We are not told her name or her age or what precisely she is sweeping. And that is deliberate. She is not an individual in the modern sense, with a resume and accolades. She is every woman who kept going, every caretaker, every laborer, every person whose work did not demand attention but was essential all the same. Her sweeping is an act of maintenance, and maintenance is often the most overlooked form of labor. It is not dramatic like invention, nor dazzling like performance. It simply ensures that things do not fall apart. She is not cleaning for recognition. She is cleaning because the act is part of life. Her refusal to replace the broom is not necessarily about frugality. It could be about habit, about trust in what is known. New things, after all, require adjustment. They come with the unknown. The old broom is familiar, it behaves as expected. In a life perhaps marked by routine or quiet solitude, consistency has its own kind of comfort. There's also a sort of reverence in her continued use. By never discarding the broom, she honors the accumulation of moments it represents. Every stroke it has made, every bit of dust it has caught, is still part of it. The idea that it was enough holds power beyond the literal. In a society often obsessed with optimization, excess, and constant betterment, there is something radical in saying that something, even in its diminishment, is sufficient. The phrase echoes in more ways than one. It might apply not only to the broom, but to her, too. She may be aged, slower, and quieter. She may not sweep as fast as she once did, but she is still enough. She is still participating in the cycle of care. The broom's condition mirrors the aging of the person using it. The polished handle may reflect her own hands, worn with time. The thinning bristles might parallel her own hair or energy, and yet neither she nor the broom is discarded. Both continue with quiet dignity. There's no crisis in the decay, only continuity. The cycle of wear is not something to fear here. It is respected. It is part of the object story. There is also a spiritual dimension to the scene. Sweeping has always carried symbolic weight across cultures: cleansing, renewal, preparation. Monks sweep temple floors not merely to clean them, but to practice mindfulness. In many traditions, sweeping is a ritual of transition. In this context, the act becomes more than maintenance. It becomes presence. She is fully within the moment, broom in hand, body moving through a space. It's meditation disguised as labor. The broom is her anchor to the tangible world. And what of the silence in which this occurs? The scene is quiet. We are told no one else speaks. There's no mention of background noise, conversation, or interruption. The silence is not oppressive, it is serene. Into that silence, the whispering bristles move gently. The only sound might be the soft rasp of old straw against the floor, a sound that says, "I'm still here." It's a resistance to disappearance. As long as she sweeps, she exists with purpose. In a broader historical context, this image also touches on forgotten or invisible labor. Think of the women whose lives were measured not by achievements or records, but by repetitions. Those who cooked, cleaned, nursed, folded, and mended. Their names are not inscribed on statues, but their work made everything else possible. The broom is a tool of the unsung. The fact that it was never replaced is not just practical, it is symbolic of a kind of legacy. That isn't built by glory, but by endurance. We might also imagine what would happen to the broom after her. Would someone throw it out, not knowing its story? Would it end up in a museum, mislabeled and misunderstood? Or would it quietly vanish, as she might, having lived a life of purpose without spectacle? In that disappearance, there is a kind of grace. Nothing demands to be remembered here, and yet it is worthy of remembrance. Even more deeply, the broom becomes a metaphor for time itself. As the bristles wore down, the days did too, one by one, swept up in the slow erosion of routine. Nothing dramatic marked their passing. No fireworks, no declarations. Just a woman sweeping, again and again, until the bristles were gone. Until perhaps she was gone. But the work had been done. This raises questions about what we value. In a culture that often celebrates novelty and speed, what happens to the slow, the worn, and the quiet? What happens to the objects and people who do not shout for attention, but simply continue? Do we miss them until they're gone? Do we realize, too late, that the bristle's so thin, so fragile, it held more meaning than we ever stopped to notice? The poetic simplicity of the scene encourages us to slow down, to look again at the things we've dismissed, to see the broom not as broken or outdated, but as seasoned, to see the act of sweeping not as tedious but as sacred, and to ask ourselves what we continue, what we carry forward, even when the world forgets to ask why. And still, it was enough. There's comfort in that, a kind of assurance that we, too, might wear down in time, that we, too, might be quiet and unnoticed, that our efforts may be small, our tools imperfect, and yet we might still be enough. Not perfect, not new, but enough. That is perhaps the deepest truth in this small, gentle passage. It offers not a grand philosophy, but a tender mercy. So, in the end, the woman and her broom are not just about labor or history or decline. They are about presence, about choosing to continue, about understanding that life is not always in the grand acts but in the gestures repeated so often. They cease to be noticed yet hold the whole structure together. The broom's bristles were down to nothing, but she kept sweeping, and it was enough. There had once been a bell. That much, at least, was known or suspected. There were no inscriptions left behind, no official edicts or legends carved into stone. Just the faint architectural clues: a high beam shaped unnaturally straight, a notch in the rafters where a rope might have once run, and an absence that felt oddly specific. Records of the bell's purpose were misplaced, not lost, not burned, not deliberately removed, just somewhere else now. Perhaps a ledger crumbled in the back of a drawer, or a scroll faded into illegibility in a room that never quite dried after the rain. No one had come looking for it in years, and so the bell, its meaning, and even its sound had quietly unraveled from memory. Still, time passed. Time did what it always did softly. There was no urgency in its step here. No ticking, no chimes to divide one moment from the next. Just the slow unfurling of days into weeks, into seasons, into years. In this place, the very idea of schedules had withered. Routine softened until they were indistinguishable from silence. Dust did not rush to settle, it wandered gently down, content to take its place on windowsills, shelves, and sloped stone ledges that remembered more use than they saw. Time left fingerprints, most tenderly soft circles of faded color where once jars had stood. A gentle slope in the wood where countless feet had paused and pivoted. Time did not declare itself here. It absorbed. Old tools waited, patient and unused. A brush still leaned in its jar, though the bristles had long given up their spring. A chisel rested beside stone that hadn't needed carving in years. A ladle, perfectly shaped to pour, hung from its peg like it had only just been set aside. None were abandoned with violence or intent. They were simply left, one by one, on days too busy to finish, or on evenings when the light dimmed just enough to say, tomorrow. But tomorrow had its weight. Other hands never came, and so the tools waited not resentfully, but with the dignified stillness of those who once served a purpose well and now simply were. The ground didn't vibrate, not from feet, nor carts, nor song. No footfall echoed through the stones. No rhythms pounded to mark a festival or a funeral. The silence beneath one's shoes here was whole, so complete that even breath seemed reluctant to disturb it. Beneath the soil, roots twisted with a kind of slowness that spoke not of dormancy, but of confidence. Life persisted, but it did so without fanfare. It grew in the absence of disturbance, unbothered by the lack of attention. The world above continued, but it did not move in the ways it once did. No one asked the bell why. No one stood beneath its eaves and tugged gently on the rope to hear what sound it might make. No one passed their hand across its surface, searching for an inscription or a name. If it was noticed at all, it was as a shaved shadow against sky, curve above beam. Its purpose, once so sure, no longer calls out to be remembered. It was not dismissed with cruelty. It was simply allowed to fade, as many things are when life no longer needs what they once offered. And yet, the bell didn't mourn its purpose. It did not crack. It did not rust into oblivion. It stood, whole, though time had worn its luster into dullness. It did not cry out for relevance or repair. It accepted the wind and the quiet and the fact that no one reached for it anymore. In this forgetting, there was no tragedy, only stillness. A stillness so complete it almost felt deliberate. The bell, like the place itself, had not been forgotten so much as released. Dusk returned every day, but the ring didn't. The sun slipped low as it always had, casting its golden limbs through crooked windows and cracked slats. Shadows stretched and softened. There was no note to signal the closing of the day, no metallic resonance to mark its passage. Once, surely, there had been such a note, perhaps sharp and eager, or maybe low and mournful. But now, there was only the hush. The bell stood mute against the sky, and the dusk, in turn, respected its silence. It came, lingered, and left without expecting an announcement. They had meant to write something down the books they never wrote. Not important volumes, perhaps. Not manifestos or histories destined for great shelves. But small things, practical things. A recipe that only one person ever got quite right. A song passed from voice to voice, subtly reshaped over time until its origins blurred. A phrase someone's grandmother always used that made everyone laugh, even if no one could explain why. They meant to record these. A list, a sketch, a line or two. But they were tired, or the ink ran low, or they thought surely someone else would remember. Someone else would write it down. And so nothing was. Not out of neglect, out of life. Life, full as it was, simply left no pause for inscription. And time, too patient to argue, swept those unwritten things into the same quiet that now held the bell. The sunlight waited to be reflected as it lowered itself across the sky. It reached through the windows in angled rays, soft and golden. The room it entered didn't sparkle. There was no polished marble or crystal to meet it, but in one corner, just one, the stone floor had been worn so smooth by years of sweeping, scrubbing, pacing, and kneeling that it almost glowed. Not brightly, not like a mirror, but with the kind of softness that light seems to choose. That one spot caught the sun and returned it not in brilliance, but in remembrance. A gentle echo, a nod, proof that, once, hands had cared for this place. That attention had been given, not in extravagance, but in repetition. Over and over, the same stroke, the same motion. The kind of care that accumulates not for display, but because it matters. There is a kind of silence that is not sad, a kind of stillness that is not stagnant. Here, in this place where the bell no longer rings, there remains the presence of what once was, not loudly, not obviously, but thoroughly. The air still remembers what it felt like to carry sound. The walls still bear the faint marks of presence. The floor, though scuffed and faded, still receives the light in just the right way. Nothing calls out for restoration. Nothing cries for attention. Instead, everything waits not for return, but for recognition. For the kind of glance that lingers just long enough to say, yes, something happened here. And though the records are misplaced, and the books unwritten, and the bell unmoved, that is enough. Because time, as always, continues softly. She never asked what it was for, because the answer was never part of the point. She swept not as a means to an end, but as the end itself. There was no audience. No one commented when the dust was cleared, nor noticed when it gathered again. But she swept, not because she had to, or because she had been told to, but because the motion made sense in her hands. It gave shape to the moment in ways that speech or planning never did. The broom made soft sounds as it passed over the floor, and that sound told her everything she needed to know. That time was moving, that the day had not yet ended, and that something was still within her reach. There was no ceremony to the way she picked up the broom. No dramatic pause, no sigh. Just a gentle, practiced bend of the fingers, a natural tilt of the wrist. It was so familiar that it felt almost unconscious. The way a person might stretch their legs when sitting too long or rub a thumb across a coffee mug. As handled without noticing. And that simple motion was everything. Continuation, memory, and a quiet form of intention that asked for nothing in return. The room had no particular cleanliness to it, not in the way you'd expect. The sweeping didn't change its nature, it didn't transform it into something new. It remained what it was, a room lived in, quiet, marked by time. But the sweeping added a softness to it, as though the act of care given without demand somehow made the space feel less forgotten. She swept like someone brushing hair from the face of someone asleep, not to wake them, not to make them presentable, just because they were loved. The others had long since stopped noticing. Some assumed she did it out of habit. Others assumed it was her way of keeping busy, or filling silence, or clinging to something she couldn't name. But they were missing it entirely. It wasn't clinging, it was tending. It was continuity, not for the sake of tradition, but for the sake of rhythm. The sweeping didn't anchor her to the past, it grounded her in the present. It was the only thing that didn't ask questions. It didn't wonder what came next. It didn't pretend to offer resolution. It simply needed doing, and that was enough. She had, perhaps, once known purpose in sharper terms: chores assigned, tasks completed, a clock watched, a schedule kept. But that had faded with the years. The clarity of obligation had dissolved, and in its place was something gentler. She didn't live by plans now. She lived by the curve of sunlight on the floorboards, by the temperature of the morning tea, by the creak the chair made when she first sat down each day. The broom fit into that rhythm. It didn't impose. It belonged. There was something sacred in that kind of ordinariness. Not a loud, liturgical sacredness, but something quiet, or something wrapped in patience. Each stroke of the broom was a small reminder that she still could, that she still noticed, that she was still here. And more than that, that being here was, in itself, enough. The dust came back, of course. It always did. That was part of it. She didn't sweep to defeat it. The dust wasn't an enemy. It was a reminder of presence. Things lived and moved and decayed. And in that cycle, this was just another form of testimony. The broom didn't resist the truth. It moved through it. It acknowledged it and carried on. Some days, the dust caught in the sunlight like floating thoughts, suspended in golden light. She would watch it for a moment before sweeping it away, not hurried, not scolding, just clearing space again, making room for the next quiet hour. The room didn't change, and neither did she, not in any dramatic way. But the stillness grew lighter. It breathed easier. She didn't keep count of how often she swept. It wasn't a matter of schedule or progress. The sweeping didn't accumulate value by being done many times. It had value simply by being done at all. It was a thing that didn't need to be justified. It just was. People often seek purpose like a ladder, one rung leading to the next, every motion building to some high, distant goal. But her sweeping wasn't a ladder. It was a circle, a tide, a heartbeat, something that returned not because it failed, but because it knew that returning was the point. It made no promises of permanence. It left no monuments. And yet, it endured. The floor was never spotless, nor did it need to be. There were edges she could not reach, corners where the dust gathered, no matter how carefully she moved. But the act was not made lesser by its imperfection. The act was whole because it was honest. It was enough that the broom passed over the same place again and again. It was enough that she continued. She didn't ask what it was for, because she understood something others often forget. Not everything must be for something. Some things just are. Some gestures hold their meaning, carry their worth, by simply existing. The world teaches us to calculate, to assign value, to chase results. But some truths slip through the cracks of the thinking. Truths that settle into the quiet spaces. Truths that linger in the curve of a woman's hand as she sweeps a floor no one told her needed sweeping. There was, tucked somewhere deep in her motion, a memory. Not a specific image, but a kind of warmth. A familiarity. Perhaps once, years ago, someone had swept beside her. A grandmother, maybe a sister. A child who had learned by watching. Or maybe not. Maybe the memory was of a sound, the soft scrape of bristles, the echo of quiet rooms, or of a feeling the solid wood beneath her feet, the shifting light as the dust danced through it. Memory, in this case, didn't need clarity. It only needed to hum gently, the way absence hums when you notice it less as pain and more as presence once held. She never asked what it was for, and no one ever told her. But if they had, if someone had tried to explain it, tried to name it, or place it in a box, perhaps the sweeping would have changed. Perhaps it would have become something else, an obligation, a task to be judged. But untouched by explanation, it remained pure. It remained hers. There is a kind of freedom in doing something that doesn't need justification. A rare, precious freedom. She moved through it as though through open air. The broom guided her, lightly, and the day continued. Sometimes, visitors would come. They would sit, they would talk, they would look around the room, at the floor, at the woman with the broom, and they might not say anything. But some part of them would notice the calm, the steadiness, the way things felt cared for without being fussed over. They didn't ask why she swept. They didn't need to. In her quiet rhythm, they saw something they didn't know they'd been missing. Maybe they would remember it later, in some still moment of their own. The way she moved, not hurried. The way the broom made a sound like breathing. The way she didn't ask, or explain, or need to. The way she just did it. And maybe, one day, they would do the same. Sweep without reason, care without condition. Move through a moment simply because the moment was there. Even if they didn't, the sweeping would go on. The dust would settle, as it always does. The light would shift, the day would continue, and she would pick up the broom, not with ceremony, not with urgency, but with something deeper, something quieter. A knowing. She would sweep again, and the room would respond, not with change, perhaps, but with recognition, with a softness that said, yes, this is what we do. This is what remains. And still, she never asked what it was for, because by then, it had become clear. It didn't need to be for anything. It simply was. And that, quietly, was more than enough. There are certain tasks that outlive the urgency that once birthed them. They continue long after their original purpose has been forgotten or rendered obsolete. Yet they go on not because they are needed in the way they once were, but because they have become something else entirely. They are no longer actions of utility, but of rhythm, of memory, of being. The candle maker worked like this. He did not measure the wax. There was no scale, no spoon, and no jar with lines to indicate volume. He did not consult a list or read from a fading scrap of parchment. He did not count the seconds as the wax melted or as it cooled. His hands moved not because they had been taught, but because they remembered. There is a kind of knowing that becomes so deep, so quiet, that it forgets it ever began. That is how he worked, pouring, dipping, trimming, setting not as a man producing candles, but as a man fulfilling a gesture so old it no longer required thought. The space around him was warm, but not hot. The air carried a constant murmur, the soft bubbling of wax in the kettle, the occasional creak of wooden beams adjusting themselves, and the faintest hum. That might have been a song or merely the breath of someone accustomed to silence. The room smelled of honey, yes, but not in the way of sweetness. It was not the scent of something to eat or something to crave. It was the memory of bees, of sun, of comb scraped and boiled, of labor done far away from here and long ago. And under that sweetness, the quiet insistence of old smoke. It lived in the walls, in the ceiling beams, in the worn apron tied at his waist, and in the very stones that made up the hearth. The light in the room did not need to be bright. It gathered in pools, small golden puddles cast by the flames of the very candles he made. A circle here, a corner there. Sometimes the flicker landed on his hands, illuminating the worn creases of fingers that had dipped thousands upon thousands of tapers. Each dip of the wick into hot wax was a return, a rhythm. Lift, cool, dip again. There was something of prayer in it, though he did not pray. Or if he did, it was not with words. Visitors rarely came, and when they did not stay long. The quiet of the space seemed to wrap itself around them, muffling footsteps and questions alike. Those who watched often remarked that he did not speak while he worked. But it wasn't silence out of rudeness or focus. It was a silence of compatibility, of not needing to say what had already been said 1,000 times through emotion. He made candles for places that no longer needed them, chapels where no one knelt, corridors where no feet passed, tables that saw no meals, and altars that bore no offerings. Still, the candles were made, bundled in twine, placed in crates, and delivered to places that remember long after people forgot. Some were lit, some were not. It hardly mattered. The making was the point. He remembered when he had been shown how. A hand over his own, a voice explaining that the wax had to be just so not too hot, not too cool or it would slip, that the wick must be cut at an angle so the flame would not gutter, that beeswax could crack if the mold cooled too fast. These details once felt like rules. Now they were breath. He no longer recalled the face of the one who taught him, only that the teaching had happened. And perhaps that was the truest mark of memory, not the image or the voice, but the echo that remained in the doing, like a stone worn smooth by decades of water. He could no longer point to where it started. It had always been like this. The tools he used were old but cared for. The ladle with its darkened edge, the rods for dipping, the trays are lined with cloth. Each had a place and a purpose, and though he did not look when he reached for them, his hands found them with ease. There were no labels, no marks, just instinct and habit, and a kind of trust that the next motion would arrive on time, because it always had. Sometimes, in the deeper parts of night, when the only sound was the settling of wax in its mold and the soft ticking of cooling metal, he would pause, not because he was tired, but because something asked him to. Not out loud, but with the hush of the room. In those moments, he would look at what he had made, not to admire, not to critique, but simply to see, to be reminded that something now existed that had not existed before. There was no audience for his work, no ledger, no tally of how many candles he had made this month or year. He did not count them. He did not name them. And yet, in their repetition, each held something slightly different. A curl of wick here, a droplet of wax cooled at an angle there. Not floss traces, marks of a moment in time, evidence that a hand had touched them, that a person had been present. He never rushed. Candles, like memories, could not be forced. Too fast, and the layers would not bind. Too impatient, and the shape would warp. It required patience, the kind that forgets itself, the kind that doesn't count the minutes but welcomes them, the kind that sees the wax not as a task, but as a companion. When storms came, and the wind howled at the shutters, he kept working. Not because the light was needed, not because the room was dark, but because his hands knew no other answer to thunder than the steady dip of wick into wax. When snow pressed against the windows, he lit the first candle and placed it beside the door, not as a beacon, but as a gesture, a remembering. He did not ask where the wax came from now. Long ago, he might have known the beekeepers by name, traded stories with them, and perhaps even shared bread. Now the wax arrived in crates with no inscription, wrapped in cloth. It smelled the same. That was enough. Some evenings, the smell of the cooling wax reminded him of moments he could not place, a harvest night perhaps, or a festival where lanterns once lined a long forgotten road. He would pause briefly, the tip of his finger tracing the edge of a taper, and then return to his work. The memory was not sharp. It did not need to be. It was not calling him back, only visiting. He lived in the room behind the workshop. A bed, a table, and a stove. Simple, but sufficient. There was no need for more. The light from his own candles lit the space. They sat on shelves, in clusters, in holders made of wood and iron, and once, a smooth piece of river stone. When he slept, their light burned low. When he woke, the wick was trimmed, the wax ray melted, and the day begun again. There were no grand philosophies behind his life, no manifestos, no declarations. He had not chosen this path as one chooses a vocation. He had walked it long enough that it had become the ground itself. It no longer occurred to him to do otherwise. And in this quiet, in this repetition, in this daily dance of hand and flame and wax and silence, something endured. Not loudly, not to be noticed, but like the scent of honey in a place no bees remained. Like a rhythm that continues after the music ends. He would keep pouring, keep dipping, keep trimming. The candles would keep being made. And long after no one remembered who he was, they would still be found on a shelf and a drawer. Lit in a storm, flickering in an empty hallway, offering light to no one in particular. But still, offering, just as he had. In a room tucked far from urgency, there sat a small collection of candles and lit, unbothered, and burned. They rested not in defiance nor in neglect, but in a kind of suspended intention, as though waiting for a world that had quietly gone somewhere else. These were not just candles in a functional sense, not merely wax and wick to chase away darkness. Each had been set aside for something once imagined, something hoped for. There were candles for vigils, to hold the weight of longing. Candles for dinners, to soften conversation and illuminate shared meals. Candles for prayer, meant to accompany words that rose to places unseen. But now, no vigil came to pass. No dinner was served. No whispered prayer echoed off the walls. The candles remained, intact and untouched, still believing they might be needed. It is easy to think of objects as passive things, as forgettable accessories to human life. But sometimes, when everything else has gone quiet, their waiting becomes louder than action. These candles did not mourn their stillness. They simply waited, with the dignity of something built to serve a purpose, even if the purpose would never come. Their silence was not resignation. It was not despair. It was patience in its purest, most unchanging form. Each one was a small promise made long ago, not to anyone in particular, perhaps, but to a rhythm of life that once pulsed through the room. The dinner candle promised warmth, a flicker over bread and shared stories. Its wide base suggested it had been meant to burn for hours, its flame standing tall beside laughter, cutlery, and maybe even wine. The vigil candle was slender and pale, set apart from the others, made to stand alone and burn low into the night. It carried solemnity in its shape, in its very posture, something intended for moments that required endurance, patience, and reverence. The prayer candle, marked faintly by a thumbprint near the base, seemed to ask for little more than breath and quiet. It was the kind of candle that expected tears, though it did not demand them. These purposes were never fulfilled, but the potential lingered. That was the strange magic of them. They had never done the thing they were made to do, yet still carried the memory of having once been considered for it. They bore the ghost of intention, and that ghost was quiet, but it stayed. The room they occupied had long since lost the human energy that first shaped it. Dust had settled gently over shelves and along the edges of picture frames. The air, unmoving and soft, seemed to hold its breath. But the candles waited as though time might still circle back, as if someone might walk in, reach for a match, and rekindle all those once familiar rituals. There is a kind of sadness in unlit candles, but it's not the kind that cries out. It's a subdued grief, one that understands it has no audience. They did not mourn out loud for the guests who never arrived. Instead, they offered a different kind of companionship. They simply stayed. They did not expire. They did not demand attention. They just existed in readiness, in the quiet dignity of the unused. Perhaps it is not so different from certain corners of our own hearts, those that hold memories of things hoped for, things prepared for, even if they never came to pass. The candles speak silently to those unused plans, to the place settings that were never filled, to the letters never sent, to the rooms cleaned for company that never arrived. They are a metaphor for the tender act of preparing for joy, even if joy forgot to knock. But the candles are not bitter. There is no resentment in their waxy stillness. If they could speak, they might say they were honored to be ready. That being meant for something was enough. They were selected, arranged, and made with care. And even if their flames were never struck, they became part of the room's language, silent but deliberate. They watched seasons pass without flicker. Light came and went from the windows, casting soft shadows across them in the mornings and slanting golden evening light over their shapes at dusk. Sometimes, that light almost looked like fire. But it wasn't. It never was. And still, they waited. There's a certain kind of devotion in that. Not devotion to a person, but to a possibility. These were not utility objects forgotten in a drawer. They had been displayed, positioned, left in visible places, almost ceremonially. Each one stood in a kind of tableau on a mantel beside a clock that no longer ticked, on a dining table cleared of dishes long ago, on a bedside stand with a prayer book whose pages curled gently at the edges. The candles had company in stillness. Other quiet things surrounded them, things that once had a purpose but now had only patience. There is something hauntingly beautiful about a candle that has never burned. The wick is white or beige, untouched by flame. It curls delicately, pristine. It doesn't know heat. It doesn't know how to melt. It exists in its unaltered state, its silence unbroken. But in that untouched quality lies a strange, invisible burden. Because what it was meant for, the light, the warmth, the illumination, remains potential and never memory. In a way, an unlit candle is all future and no past. But perhaps that's the point. In some spaces, in some lives, there must be symbols of possibility left intact. Not everything needs to unfold. Some things exist to show that something could have happened, that something was once expected, that someone once believed there would be a reason to light the flame. The candles became their own kind of archive, not of action, but of anticipation. And so they stayed. No one arrived to light them. No hand brushed past and set one aglow. But still they were not useless. They bore witness. They observed quietly the days that began and ended without drama. They were part of a rhythm that no longer needed noise to prove it was alive. They stood still, and that stillness became part of the story. Because even now, in their silence, in their unburned bodies, the candles evoke stories. Who were the guests once imagined? What dinner was planned? What loss was meant to be honored in vigil? What prayer once lingered in someone's mind, perhaps never spoken, but prepared for? The candles don't answer. They simply suggest, and suggestion is sometimes more powerful than memory. They also remind us that purpose can be expansive. We think of purpose as something active, something fulfilled, something completed. But these candles show us another way of being. They were made with purpose, yes, but they do not cease to matter, because that purpose remained unfulfilled. Their existence still carries intention, and intention, even dormant, can shape the feeling of a place. The room might have lost its voices. It might echo now where laughter once lived, but it still carries the ghost of the former life. And the candles are part of that haunting, a kind of soft echo of what could have been. It is tempting to pity them, to see their waiting as a kind of tragedy. But that might be a projection. Perhaps they don't feel unfinished at all. Perhaps they feel complete simply because they were ready. In a world where so many things happen without preparation, without pause, these candles were an act of waiting. And waiting, in itself, can be an act of love. Maybe someone once placed them there not just for guests or rituals, but for the simple comfort of knowing they were available. A home, however still, is made of gestures like that, preparations for lives that intersected once or might again. And so the candles stayed. They did not melt down into hollow stumps. They did not flicker or fade, but their presence continued to mean something. They were the final punctuation in sentences no longer spoken. They were the last promise left standing when the rest of the world moved on. Not broken, not forsaken, just still. Their story isn't about absence. It's about quiet readiness. It's about the beauty of something waiting, not desperately, not needily, but faithfully. Their purpose may never be fulfilled in the traditional sense, but they fulfilled another role entirely. They became symbols. Symbols of care, of hope, of intention. They were meant for light, yes, but in their darkness, they illuminated something else, the poetry of preparation, the grace and stillness, and the warmth that remains even when the flame never comes. And in that, they were never wasted. There is a rhythm to routines, a pulse that moves without question through the days. Some acts are not grand gestures, not declarations of intent or revelation, but small, deliberate marks that tether the present to something anything more lasting. For him, labeling candles was such a ritual. It was not art, not even quite craftsmanship. It was something gentler than both an act of quiet witnessing. Each day, he would take the candles as they cooled and hardened, smooth and pale, and he would write their names by hand. Anniversary, storm, new moon. Each label was a whisper of context, a gesture that assigned meaning to wax and wick. They were not just candles, they were moments in time, captured before they could float away. He had done this for years, possibly decades. No one remembered exactly when he began. The first label had not been meant as a tradition, just a note to help distinguish the batches. But as the days stretched into seasons, and the seasons folded into years, the habit became a quiet necessity. The labels turned the candles into memory keepers. Lighting one wasn't just illumination, it was the gentle summoning of a night it remembered. Anniversary might burn soft and warm, a flicker that felt like the silence shared between two people who'd stopped needing words. Storm was steadier, firmer in its flame, and meant to accompany the clatter of rain against shutters. New moon barely glowed at all, its wax a little darker, its scent faint and earthy. But on that day, one that arrived like any other, without trumpet or omen, he didn't write a single label. The candles were made just as always. He measured the wax, stirred the pot, and watched it shimmer and pull like melted pearl. He poured carefully and evenly and trimmed the wicks once they cooled. He arranged them neatly in rows, the same way he always had. But when the time came to write the labels, he simply didn't. The pen was nearby. The tags were stacked beside the twine. Nothing was missing except the impulse. He sat for a while, hands resting on the edge of the bench. The room was not particularly cold or warm. Outside, the wind was doing whatever it normally did. The world had not changed, but something had. He looked at the candles. They looked back at him, blank-faced and mute. They were still candles, still capable of lighting a room or perfuming a prayer. But they carried no name, no story. He told himself it was nothing, a small lapse, a skip step. The body, perhaps, is asking for a day's rest. But deep down he knew this was not fatigue. It was a kind of quiet surrender, not to grief, not to despair, but to the realization that the naming had not stopped time from slipping past. For all the years he labeled the candles, time had continued its endless soft erosion. People still forgot, moments still vanished, names still faded. Perhaps that was the deeper truth. The labels had never been about classification. They had been about preservation, a way of trying to insist that a single day could matter more if marked, that a feeling could last longer if named. But names, too, fade. That morning, when he lit the last candle from the storm batch, he had noticed how little he remembered of the storm it referenced. Was it rain that clattered like stones? Or was it only wind that day? He couldn't recall. He had given the moment a name, but the name had not saved it. And so, he sat beside a line of nameless candles and did nothing. It wasn't sad, exactly. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something inside you gently gives way, like snow sliding from a roof. Later, someone would notice. They might ask, "Why didn't you name these?" And he wouldn't know how to answer. Perhaps he'd just shrug. Perhaps he'd say the candles didn't need it. That light was enough. The strange thing was they still worked. That night, he lit one. It burned the way all of his candles did, steady, sure, just a little slower than most. It filled the room with that faint scent he could never quite name. It flickered gently, and in its glow, the room felt no less warm, no less safe. In some ways, it felt freer, as if the candle had nothing to live up to. It was not expected to carry a memory. It simply was. And he sat with that for a while. The idea that not everything needed a label to be real. That maybe a moment didn't need to be defined to be meaningful. He had tried for years to hold on to pen the wings of time with ink and string. But maybe now it was enough just to be in it, without needing to capture it, without needing to call it anything. He had not stopped loving the act of naming. But he had begun to understand that not naming could also be a kind of love. The next day, he did the same. Made the candles, smoothed them, stacked them, left the labels untouched. He didn't announce this change. There was no proclamation, no farewell to the past. Just the gentle turning of a page that no one heard. Some people still bought the candles, and some didn't notice the difference. A few asked, and he would say, "They're unnamed now, but still good," and they would nod, as if that made perfect sense. Others smiled more knowingly, quietly approving the shift, as if they too were tired of naming every hour. And slowly, the idea took hold. The candles became more mysterious. People lit them without knowing what they were for, and so they began to assign their own meanings. One might light a candle and say, "This is for her birthday," even though it wasn't labeled. Another might light one in silence, not knowing what it marked, but sensing that the light itself was enough. And maybe that was the better way, to leave the space open, to let people fill it themselves. He found the days moved a little differently now, less bound, more fluid. He still noticed the new moons, still remembered the anniversaries, still paused at the first sign of rain, but he no longer felt the need to write them down. He let them pass, not ignored, but unheld, allowed to flow rather than be fixed. He didn't regret the years of labels. They had helped him survive something, though he never quite knew what. They had anchored him, give the day a shape, but he no longer needed the anchors. The sea had grown calmer. Or maybe he had simply learned to float. He kept the old labels in a drawer. Occasionally, he would open it and sift through them, read them softly aloud. Harvest, arrival, dusk. They still held a quiet beauty, but they were no longer necessary. Like a well-loved book, whose pages you know by heart. You don't always need to read it again to feel what it gave you. And so, he continued, candle by candle, quietly, without a name. The room where he worked still smelled faintly of wax and smoke and cedar wood. The shelves still held jars of color and oil. The bench still bore the grooves of long use. But something had shifted, not lost, just loosened. One day, years later, someone new would take over the space. They would find the drawer of labels and wonder. Perhaps they would revive the tradition. Perhaps they would start a new one. Or perhaps they too would leave the candles unnamed, understanding without needing to be told. Because sometimes, what is most meaningful is not what is recorded, but what is allowed to pass without capture. A candle that burns not for anniversary or storm, but just because it is dark, and someone needs light, and in that quiet burning, something is remembered anyway, even if no one writes it down. In the dim light of the small workshop, the flicker of the last candle's flame wavered before surrendering to the shadows. It was a quiet place, filled with a scent of beeswax and smoke, the faint hum of the evening settling in. For years, he had watched the wax coal, watched it solidify from warm liquid into the hardened form that would carry light through dark hours. It was a careful, attentive task, an act of reverence both to the material and the purpose it served. Watching the wax was more than just a part of the work, it was a ritual. He knew the way the surface would first shimmer with heat, smooth and soft, then slowly dull as it drew itself together. The slight cracking sounds as it shrank ever so gently, releasing the tension of transformation. He knew the moment when the wax was ready to be handled, when it had moved beyond fragility but had not yet become brittle. Each batch was a small story in itself, a pattern of heat and cool, light and dark, fluidity and form. On most nights, he would remain there, seated near the table, eyes tracing the slow changes with careful patience. Sometimes he would hum, sometimes he would simply breathe in time with the cooling process. His presence was part of the wax's journey. It mattered. His watchful gaze was a kind of quiet promise, to the candle, to himself, to whatever light might be needed in the hours ahead. But the day was different. That day, the chair near the door held him, and the doorway itself framed him like a picture he barely noticed. The workshop was still warm from the day's labor, but the air outside had begun to cool as dusk folded over the horizon. Somewhere beyond the small window, birds made their last calls. A neighbor's door creaked closed, The world was turning toward evening, but his attention did not follow. He sat back and let the day's fatigue settle into his bones. The candles hardened without his gaze. The wax cooled, untouched, unsupervised, its surface tightening and dulling as the warmth ebbed away. He did not see the subtle cracking, the soft settling that usually marked the end of the process. He did not check for imperfections or areas that needed smoothing. For once, the ritual paused, not broken, just set aside. It was not neglect. It was simply a moment when life demanded something else, a breath, a pause, a surrender to the quiet waiting that happens at day's end. Sometimes, even the most careful watcher must step back, allow the world to turn without insistence, and the wax patient and uncomplaining waited, too. In that silence, the workshop felt different, not empty, but filled with absence. The tools rested more heavily. The scent of beeswax seemed thicker, as if holding its breath. The light dimmed in corners where shadows lengthened. It was a reminder that presence is not always an action, and absence is not always loss. Sometimes, it is simply space. When he finally rose and moved toward the table, the candles were already cool to the touch. The wax had hardened beyond the usual soft resilience. A few small cracks traced lines across surfaces that would normally have been perfectly smooth under his eyes. They would still burn, certainly. The light would still flicker in dark rooms. But there was a different, subtle, quiet. But there, he regarded the candles without disappointment or blame. There was no fault in the momentary letting go. No failure in the choice to rest, to watch the world from a doorway instead of through a glass of warm wax. The imperfection was part of the story, now another line in the unfolding rhythm of days and nights. And so, with gentle hands, he gathered the candles. The edges were a little more brittle than usual. The glow would be a little less steady, but the purpose remained. The wax still carried light, warded off darkness. The act of making did not end with perfection, but with intention. And intention does not always demand constant vigilance. Outside, dusk deepened. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the glass, catching dust motes in their path. The world turned softly toward night, just as it always had, just as it always would. The candles, cooled and hardened without notice, were ready to meet the coming dark. In that small pause, in that soft moment of unguarded stillness, there was something deeply whole, a reminder that even the smallest acts of care include room for rest. That light can come from both attention and letting go. That cooling wax, left alone, can still become a bearer of hope. And so the day ended. The candles waited, the watcher rested, the light awaited its turn to rise again. The night came softly, without urgency or demand. It did not arrive like a thief or a storm, nor did it burst in with the weight of expectation. Instead, the darkness folded itself gently around the edges of the day, sliding over the landscape with quiet inevitability. There was no need for light, not tonight. At least, the candles remained untouched, standing sentinel in their holders, complete and whole as if preserved in time. The night did not ask for anything, and so nothing was offered in return. This is a night that knew its place. It did not seek to disrupt or to conquer. It did not shout for attention, nor did it beg for resistance. It simply was. A gentle presence, unassuming yet profound. In its arrival, there was a certain grace, a surrender to the natural order that asked neither for celebration nor for regret. The night came and asked for nothing. The world beneath the dark sky did not need illumination, not because it was devoid of life or meaning, but because the darkness itself was enough. It was a quiet companion, wrapping everything in a tender embrace. The usual flickering flames, so often called upon to dispel shadows, were left to stand in peace. Their wax unmolten, their wicks unlit, they held the promise of light. But that promise was not demanded tonight. The night accepted itself as complete. There is something deeply calming in this kind of darkness, not the oppressive, suffocating kind that traps breath and thoughts, not the darkness that invites fear or confusion, but a darkness that feels like a soft cloak, woven of shadows and silence. It is the kind of night that holds space without filling it, allowing stillness to settle and time too slow. Perhaps the night understood that sometimes the greatest act is to simply be, to arrive without imposing, to exist without demanding, to enter a room and breathe quietly with the air already there. This night did not demand candles be lit or prayers be spoken. It asked for no rituals, no actions, no resistance. It simply arrived and remained. In many ways, the night was a pause, a moment suspended between the noise of the day and the quiet of rest. It offered no answers, no urgency. It was not a question to be solved, but a presence to be embraced. The absence of light was not absence itself, but a different kind of fullness, a fullness made of space and possibility. The untouched candles stood as silent witnesses. They were not forgotten, nor neglected. They were whole. Each one held the potential of flame, but that potential was held gently, not forced into action. They waited, patient and serene, as if knowing that sometimes light must rest, that sometimes the darkness is not something to be overcome, but something to be honored. In that room, bathed in the soft absence of light, there was no hurry, no rushing to fill the silence with sound or to chase away the shadows with brightness. There was only presence. The night's presence was a quiet invitation to stillness, to surrender, to being. The candles, standing ready but untouched, echoed that invitation. They did not seek to break the night, but to accompany it. This kind of night is a balm for tired minds, for restless hearts, for bodies worn thin by the demands of the day. It is a moment where time ceases its relentless push forward and instead folds gently back on itself, where worries can dissolve into the dark and dreams can gather like soft feathers in the mind, where silence is not emptiness, but a refuge. The night came, not as a demand, but as a gift. It asked nothing because it knew that it was enough. That sometimes the deepest rest comes not from action or light, but from the quiet acceptance of what is. The darkness did not threaten. It did not challenge. It simply enveloped. On this night, there was a lesson about the beauty of receiving without needing to give, about the power of presence without purpose, about the peace found in not having to do or say or be anything other than exactly what you are. The night did not ask for light because it was complete in itself. It did not seek approval or acknowledgement. It existed simply and fully. For those who lived in that space, the night was a gentle friend. It did not rush them to sleep, nor did it force their eyes closed. It allowed them to rest at their own pace, to drift into dreams in their own time. It was patient, enduring, and constant. And because it asked for nothing, it gave everything. The candles, untouched but complete, stood as a metaphor for potential held softly, for power not wielded, but waiting, for beauty and stillness. They reminded that sometimes strength lies in waiting, not in doing. That sometimes the most profound acts are those of quiet endurance. The night came and asked for nothing, and in that asking for nothing, it became everything. A shelter, a pause, a breath held just long enough to catch your own. A space where the heart could slow and the mind could rest, where the world, momentarily, was at peace. And so, the darkness settled, not as an absence, but as a presence, not as an ending, but as a continuation. The candles remained, untouched but complete. The night held the world gently, and all was well.